You ruined my suit. Do people like you even know how much it's worth?" The most powerful man in the building raised his hand. The sound of the slap rang out across the crowded cafe. Nobody moved. Not a single person. The black woman in the worn gray coat did not cry. She did not step back. She slowly lifted her head, looked him straight in the eye, and said, very quietly, that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. Then she turned to leave. But the bodyguard standing behind the CO went utterly still. His eyes locked onto something on her wrist. A scar, shaped like a lightning bolt. The scar that, for 15 years, he had not been able to forget for a single night. That morning, everything began the way any ordinary morning begins. Loretta Bishop woke at 4:40, before the alarm could even ring. She always woke before it. 15 years now, and her body no longer needed reminding. The small apartment on the 3rd floor of an old building on the edge of Houston was still dark. She didn't turn on the main light, just a single yellow desk lamp, enough to pour coffee into a chipped thermos, enough to keep from tripping over the box of files she hadn't cleared from the middle of the floor the night before. On the kitchen table sat a stack of papers, an electric bill, a letter from the bank, and a number she had stared at until she knew it by heart. $14,200. That was all that remained in the account of Corridor Fund, the small nonprofit she had built and kept alive for years out of her own modest paychecks. $14,200, and a long list of people waiting for her help. A welder who lost 2 fingers and whose insurance refused to pay. A mother working night shifts who fell and broke her back, blamed by the company for her own carelessness. She knew every name. She always knew every name. Etta put on the gray coat. She had worn that coat for nearly 9 years. The cuffs were frayed, one button sewn back on with thread that didn't match. She'd had the money to buy a new one, many times. But each time she thought about it, she thought about the next name on the list, and the old coat followed her through one more winter. She reached for the leather bag. One strap had snapped, and she'd tied it back together with a shoelace. And before she lifted it onto her shoulder, she did the thing she did every morning, as steady as breathing. She opened the innermost pocket, took out a small object, a metal name tag, warped. One corner had melted and hardened into a shape no longer recognizable. But if you tilted it under the light, you could still faintly read the letters that remained. T. Briggs. Etta held the tag in her palm for a few seconds. She said nothing. She had never said anything. Then she tucked it back into the pocket, the same place. When she pulled the apartment door shut behind her, no one in the hallway was awake yet. Her mother had said something once, when Etta was a girl, while the two of them cleaned a church late at night with no one watching. A person isn't measured by how they look when the whole world is watching. A person is measured by what they do when no one is looking at all. Etta hadn't fully understood it then. She thought it was just something her mother said to get through a tired night. It took many years, and one night she wished she could forget, before she understood how heavy those words truly were. She caught the number 9 bus. It was still cold. She sat by the window, set the bag on her lap, and quietly rehearsed what she would say. Today was the last one, the final meeting. If that grant committee shook their heads, then by the end of the month, Corridor Fund would close. She didn't let herself think about that for too long. She just practiced each sentence, carefully, like someone walking across thin ice. The city outside the glass slowly brightened. Taxis weaving through traffic. Office workers clutching paper cups, hurrying through the early cold. No one on that bus looked twice at the woman in the gray coat. And she didn't need anyone to. That was how Etta walked into every room, quietly, expecting nothing, not needing to be noticed. The bus stopped downtown, right at the foot of a soaring glass tower. At the top of the building, a name was cut into gleaming steel, large enough to read clearly from the sidewalk below. Vance. Etta didn't look up. She only tightened her grip on the strap and walked into the lobby. Her meeting was still 40 minutes away, in an office on one of the upper floors. She had time, and she needed a place to sit, a sip of hot coffee, a quiet moment to breathe before she put the entire future of the fund on the scale. The cafe was right there in the tower's lobby. Bright, warm, the smell of coffee and pastries braided together. People in expensive suits came and went, phones in hand, talking about numbers a month of Etta's pay would never touch. She stood in line, patiently. When it was her turn, she ordered the thing she always ordered. 1 black coffee. Small, please. "Thank you, dear." The young barista's hands trembled a little from the rush. Etta smiled at her. A very small smile, the kind of smile that comes from someone who knows what it means to work until your body aches and still have to stand up straight. "Take your time, it's all right," Etta said softly. She carried her coffee to a small table by the window and sat down. She set the leather bag on the chair beside her, took out a thin folder, then pulled out her phone. The screen had cracked in a diagonal line last year. She hadn't fixed it. She checked the time. 32 minutes left. Etta drew a breath. She opened the folder, scanning the numbers she had memorized, the faces she had promised not to abandon. She touched the strap of the bag, where the metal name tag lay inside, as if touching it might give her a little more strength. She didn't know, couldn't know, that within the hour, her face would be seen by millions. She took a sip of coffee. Hot, bitter, real. Then she heard the large glass door of the lobby swing open, and the whole room, for no reason she could name, went quiet for a single beat. The glass door closed behind a man, and the temperature of the room seemed to drop a few degrees. Preston Vance walked in. Etta didn't know his name, but she recognized the way the whole room reacted. The baristas suddenly stood straighter. The cafe manager hurried out from behind the counter. A few phones came up, not to film, just because people recognized a face they'd seen on the news, in stories about billion-dollar deals. He was 46. A charcoal gray suit fitted to every seam. Behind him came two assistants and a broad-shouldered man, silent, his eyes sweeping the room out of professional habit. That was Del Okafor, who had stood at Preston's side for 10 years. Etta bent over her folder. The affairs of powerful men had nothing to do with her. She had 30 minutes and a dying fund that needed saving. It happened in a matter of seconds. The young barista, hands still shaking, rushed to carry out a tray of drinks. She didn't see the coworker turning behind her, holding a freshly brewed pot of coffee. The two collided. The hot pot tipped. A brown streak splashed sideways, landing on the sleeve and lapel of Preston Vance's charcoal gray suit. He didn't see the barista. He didn't see the collision. All he saw, in the half-second before reason could catch up with his anger, was the woman standing nearest to him. Because at that exact moment, Etta had just stood up. She only meant to reach for a napkin from the dispenser on the counter beside her. In Preston's mind, she became the cause. He spun toward her, his face contorted with a fury far larger than a few drops of coffee could justify. He demanded to know what she thought she was doing. Etta immediately explained, calmly. She said she had never touched him, that the coffee had come from behind the counter, that she had only just stood up. She kept her voice level, the levelness she had once had to learn to hold in situations far more dangerous than this one. But Preston wasn't listening. He had decided, in the space of a single breath, exactly what had happened and exactly who was to blame. And no explanation from a woman in a worn gray coat was going to change his mind. "You ruined my suit." His voice was cold, sharp, loud enough for the whole cafe to hear. "Do people like you even know how much it's worth?" His two assistants stiffened. Del took half a step forward, but he didn't yet understand what was unfolding. Then, before anyone could stop him, before anyone could even grasp what they were seeing, Preston Vance raised his hand and slapped Etta Bishop across the face in the middle of the crowded cafe. The sound seemed to echo far longer than it should have. Silence swallowed the whole room. A few customers gasped. Somewhere in the back, a phone was already raised, already recording, capturing every second of what would soon become the most talked about video in the city. Etta's head tilted slightly to one side from the force of the slap, and for a moment, no one dared to breathe. Everyone waited to see what she would do, whether she would cry, whether she would scream, or whether she would quietly walk away, the way the world always expected women like her to walk away from men like him. She did none of those things. Etta straightened her back. She lifted her chin, and she looked directly into Preston Vance's eyes, with a calm that unsettled the people watching far more than tears ever could have. One of her cheeks reddened. She did not raise a hand to cover it. She did not lower her eyes. She did not shout. She did not threaten him with lawyers, with cameras, with consequences that would have sounded hollow in that moment. She only said, in a voice so quiet that people had to lean toward her to hear it, "You just made the biggest mistake of your life." Then she bent down, picked up the leather bag with its shoelace strap, lifted it to her shoulder, and turned to walk toward the door. Preston laughed. The laugh of men who have never tasted a single real consequence in their lives, the laugh reserved for warnings they don't care to understand. He brushed off his sleeve, muttered something about people who manufacture drama for attention, then turned to order his assistant to find him a new suit before his next meeting. Around him, a few eyes flicked toward one another, uneasy, but no one spoke. Because this was the man who sat on 3 boards, who funded half the charity galas in the city, who with a single phone call could end anyone's career in that room. But one person was not laughing. Del Okafor stood rooted near the exit. His eyes did not follow Preston. They did not follow the chaos of the scrambling assistants. His eyes were locked on the empty space where Etta's wrist had been visible in the exact moment she lifted the bag to her shoulder. There, along the inside of her forearm, was a scar. Thin, pale, curved into a shape almost like a lightning bolt. The kind of scar that does not come from an everyday accident. Del's chest tightened. The room around him blurred for a second as old images came flooding back, uninvited. Smoke, fire, and the sound of metal collapsing behind a twisted steel door. He had seen that scar, that exact scar, only once in his life, 15 years ago, in circumstances he had spent 15 years trying to forget. Etta was almost at the door, and Del, without stopping to think, moved quickly after her, cutting through the crowd still frozen in shock, catching up to her just before the shape of the gray coat could dissolve into the flow of pedestrians on the sidewalk. His voice shook. He asked her a single question, a phrase that would have meant nothing to anyone else who heard it, a code that existed only between 2 people who had once survived something that could not be named. Etta stopped. She turned slowly. She looked at the broad-shouldered man standing before her, his breathing quick, his eyes rimmed red, and she answered him with exactly the answer he had both hoped for and dreaded to hear, the answer that only one person on earth could have known. Del's hands began to shake. He stood there, on the sidewalk, looking at the woman in front of him, as if he were looking at a ghost that had just stepped out of a dream he'd buried for 15 years. She said nothing more. She only gave a small nod, as if confirming something they both already knew, then turned and blended into the crowd. Del didn't follow her again. He couldn't. His legs seemed to have taken root in the sidewalk, while 15 years of unanswered questions came rushing back, settling, clicking into place as a single piece. He let her go. And he stood still there, letting the memory pull him back to the night he thought he was going to die. 15 years ago, Del Okafor was not a bodyguard. He was 29, a rescue technician with the city fire department, the kind of job that required running into buildings everyone else was running out of. He was young, still believed he was invincible, still thought courage alone was enough to keep a person alive. That night, a chemical processing plant on the edge of the city exploded after an equipment failure. By the time Del's team arrived, the fire had swallowed most of the lower floor. Dozens of night shift workers were trapped on the upper floors, behind a stairwell that had buckled from the heat. His team was ordered in, and within minutes, everything fell apart. The smoke thickened faster than anyone had predicted. The exits collapsed, one after another. The radios became static that no longer meant anything. Del remembered that chaos with a clarity that had never faded, no matter how many years passed. He remembered the feeling of losing all sense of direction in the pitch-black smoke, remembered the moment he realized he no longer knew which way was out. He remembered the cold thought, "I'm going to die here." It was then that a woman appeared out of the smoke. A young woman, not wearing firefighting gear, no oxygen tank, no reason to be inside a burning building. But she moved with a calm that defied all logic. She led group after group of trapped workers through a service corridor that not even the official rescue maps contained. Only later did Del learn. She was no stranger there. She was an occupational safety nurse contracted to the plant. She was one of the very few who knew the old maintenance corridor by heart, the one everyone had forgotten to put on the maps. She was there that night for a shift, and when the explosion came, while everyone else rushed out, she had turned back inside. She pulled people through narrow gaps. She kept panicked people from trampling one another. She counted heads, called out each name aloud, so no one would be left behind in the smoke. Del was one of the last people she found. He had collapsed in a corner, his oxygen nearly gone, his consciousness beginning to drift. He remembered a hand gripping his collar, hauling him up. He remembered a voice, hoarse from the smoke but steady as stone, telling him to get up, telling him he was not allowed to give up tonight. He remembered following her, staggering through that nameless corridor. And he remembered the moment a section of ceiling above them gave way. A length of metal pipe, glowing red from the heat, fell. She shoved him forward, out of its path. The metal slid past, tearing along the inside of her forearm, cutting a wound so deep that even then, Dell was certain she would lose the arm. She did not stop. She pressed her torn forearm against her body, blood seeping between her fingers, and she kept leading people out. She would not let anyone look at her wound until the last worker on that floor had escaped. 31 people. That night, she led 31 human beings out of death. But there was one she could not save. Dell did not witness it himself. He only heard it later, years later, from the scattered fragments of survivors. A worker named Theo Briggs was trapped behind a collapsed door in an area where the fire had blocked every route. She had tried to go back for him. She had tried, to the very last second she still could. But there are some doors that no amount of courage can open. They said that, in the final minutes, through the gap in the door, Theo told her something. A message. For his wife. And she had promised. No one knew exactly what she had promised. Only that after that night, the woman carried a dying man's promise and vanished. When the emergency crews outside tried to find her name for the official report, she was already gone. She had quietly slipped away from the chaos before any reporter or official could reach her. She left behind 31 lives, a man who had died with a final message and not a single name. The story became something close to a legend among the people who had been there that night. The nameless woman who saved an entire floor of workers and vanished before anyone could thank her. Dell searched for her for years afterward, quietly, alone, on his days off. He never turned up a single solid lead. He gave up firefighting and later became a bodyguard for powerful men because he had once felt utterly powerless inside a burning building, certain he was going to die until a stranger stepped out of the smoke and refused to let it happen. He had told himself for years that the debt could never be repaid because the woman who saved him no longer existed anywhere he could find her. He had accepted that he would never know who she was, until 15 minutes ago, until he saw that lightning bolt scar on the wrist of a woman in a worn gray coat just seconds after his own employer had slapped her across the face in a crowded cafe. The woman who had saved his life. The woman who had carried a man out of the fire on these very arms and left on her own flesh a wound that would never fully heal. That woman had just been struck in broad daylight by the man Dell had sworn to protect. He stood on the sidewalk a long time, watching the gray coat fade into the crowd, feeling 15 years of unanswered questions grow suddenly heavy in his chest. Then he turned. He walked back toward the cafe door, where Preston Vance still stood waiting for his new suit, completely unaware that the woman he had dismissed as a troublemaker, as a nobody worth throwing out, was about to overturn everything he believed about his own life. Dell walked in. His face had changed so much that even Preston stopped mid-sentence and looked up at his bodyguard. And in a low, urgent voice of a kind Preston had never heard from him in 10 years, he told Preston they needed to talk, right now. Something in Dell's voice made even Preston Vance, a man unaccustomed to being told what to do, fall silent and follow him to a quiet corner of the cafe. Preston's irritation flared the moment they were alone. His patience was already thin from the ruined suit and the whole troublesome morning. He demanded to know why his own bodyguard was making a scene over a woman who had clearly been looking for an excuse to cause trouble. Dell didn't answer right away. Instead, he told Preston to sit down. And something in the rare seriousness on his face made Preston comply without a single word of sarcasm. Dell told him. He told him about the night 15 years earlier, about the burning plant, about the trapped rescue team, about the woman who stepped out of the smoke and led 31 people out of death. He told him about the wound on her forearm, about how she had shoved him out of the path of the falling red-hot metal. He told him about how she had vanished before anyone could learn her name. Then he looked his employer directly in the eye and said the words that would not leave Preston's mind for the rest of that day. "The woman you just slapped is the woman who saved my life." Preston sat very still. The name Dell mentioned, the plant Dell described, stirred something in a corner of his memory he couldn't immediately place. Something tied to old files he had glimpsed once and never thought about again. Something tied to the early years of his father's company. He didn't yet understand the connection. But a cold unease had already begun to seep into his chest. For the rest of that day, Preston was distracted in a way his staff had never seen. He fell silent in meetings that normally demanded his full attention. He didn't snap at anyone. He just sat there, with something weighing behind his eyes. That night, he called his most trusted assistant and asked her to quietly pull every old record connected to the plant fire Dell had described. By early the next morning, the assistant brought the documents to his office, visibly hesitant, unsure how her employer would react. The plant that had burned 15 years earlier belonged to a company that, at the time, was owned by Preston's own father. A fact Preston had either forgotten or never truly registered, back when he was a young man more concerned with his own career than with the operations of a single facility. That fire had nearly destroyed the entire company. Lawsuits waiting to happen. Insurance on the brink of collapse. A public relations disaster that could have ended the family business before Preston ever inherited it, and yet the company had survived. Largely because the death toll had been far lower than the horrifying figures first predicted. A fact that the internal documents themselves attributed to the inexplicable intervention of a young woman who had led dozens of workers out of the building through a corridor no one else had thought of. Preston read and reread the documents, his fingers gripping the edges of the pages. If the death toll that night had matched the initial fears, the lawsuits alone would have bankrupted the company, stripping his family of the empire he now held. The buildings bearing his name, the board seats. His entire life, built on a foundation he had never once questioned. He thought of every interview he had ever given, describing his own will and vision as the source of everything he had achieved. Every speech in which he credited discipline and instinct. Not once had he mentioned a fire, a stranger, or a debt that had quietly propped up his entire career. Everything he owned, everything he had ever been proud of, rested to some degree on the actions of a stranger who had walked into a burning building and walked out with nothing but a scar she would carry in silence for 15 years. But the deeper he dug, the worse it got. Internal notes showed that the company's leadership at the time had discussed finding the woman who had saved the workers to compensate her, even to reward her publicly, both as a moral gesture and as a way to polish the image of a company recovering from disaster. Then the records stopped. Nothing followed. No compensation. No payment recorded to anyone matching her description. A note dated just weeks after the fire read simply that the search for the unidentified woman had been set aside in favor of more pressing matters. That woman, and whoever had raised her, whatever life she had lived since that night, had received nothing. Not a single dollar. Not a single letter. Not even an acknowledgement that the company understood what she had done for them. But that still wasn't the worst of it, because in that same file, another name appeared. Again and again. Attached to praise, to certificates, to a regional occupational safety medal. Garrett Pike, the plant's former operations director. A man who, according to every survivor account Preston could trace, had not been inside the building during the decisive minutes of the rescue. And yet for 15 years, Garrett Pike had built an entire career on the reputation of being the hero who saved his workers that night. He accepted a regional safety medal. He accepted a generous bonus from a company grateful to have limited its legal exposure. He used the story in speeches, in interviews, in later business ventures, attaching his name permanently to an act of courage that belonged to someone else entirely. And the woman who had actually done it, for 15 years, had never once stepped forward to correct the record. She had simply chosen to disappear, rather than claim a credit she never seemed to want. Preston sat alone in his office long after his staff had gone home, staring at an old photograph from the company archives, showing the charred ruins of the plant. And for the first time in years, he felt something close to shame rise in his chest. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Garrett Pike received a phone call. An old acquaintance still inside the machine of the company told him that someone was digging through the fire records, that Preston Vance was asking questions no one was supposed to ask anymore. Garrett Pike set the phone down, and for the first time in 15 years, his hand trembled a little. He was not a man to sit and wait for everything to collapse. That night, he began making a few calls to the people who had once profited alongside him from the company's gratitude after the fire. He reminded them of old favors, old silences, old agreements never put in writing. He hinted, carefully, that if his reputation collapsed, theirs would likely follow. And Etta, she knew nothing of any of it. She went home to her small apartment that night, sat down at the kitchen table, before the stack of bills and the numbers she knew by heart. The grant meeting that morning, she hadn't been able to walk into. After what happened in the lobby of that tower, She'd had no strength left to sit across from a committee and beg for the fund's future. She had called to reschedule, her voice as steady as ever, but she had sat at enough tables like that one to know what a last-minute rescheduling meant. She took the metal name tag out of the bag, set it on the table, under the yellow lamp, T. Briggs. She sat with it in her hand a long time, not crying, not speaking. She thought of Marcy, the woman she had never once let herself be seen by in 15 years. She thought of the promise she had carried out of the fire. She thought of how, if the fund closed at the end of the month, that promise would become something she could no longer keep. She wasn't thinking about the slap. She wasn't thinking about the man in the charcoal gray suit. She just sat there, in the silent room, between two people who had never truly looked into each other's eyes, one counting the last dollars of a promise, one counting the old files of a buried sin. And the metal name tag lay still on the table, under the lamp, waiting for a woman it had never met, a woman named Marcy Briggs, who the next morning would stumble into this story in a way no one saw coming. Marcy came to the small office of Corridor Fund near noon. She had no appointment. She came for a reason that was simple and heartbreaking. This month, for the first time in years, the support that had steadily arrived in her account had not come. The money that quietly covered the hospital bills insurance refused. The rent she couldn't manage, the tuition for a son now in college. 15 years, as regular as a heartbeat. And this month, it stopped. Marcy didn't know who was behind it. She had never known. Every time she tried to ask, tried to trace it, the other end was only a fund she had never heard of, one that supported the families of injured workers, with no explanation offered just for her. She had lived 15 years with an unseen benefactor. And now, when the money stopped, she came in person, just to make sure that person was all right. Etta was in the office when Marcy walked in. She recognized Marcy at once. Of course she did. She had watched this woman from a distance for 15 years, through school photographs, through the times she stood quietly at the back of the church on Theo's memorial without ever letting herself be recognized. She knew Marcy's face as well as she knew her own, and Marcy did not know who Etta was at all. "I'm sorry to come without calling ahead," Marcy said, her voice hesitant. I've received help from this fund for years. This month it didn't come. I'm not here to demand anything. I just worried something had happened to the person who's been helping me." Etta stood up. She felt something in her chest begin to break, slowly, like ice cracking underfoot. She had prepared for so many things. For the fund closing, for having to say goodbye to every name on the list. But she had never prepared for the moment this woman would stand right in front of her, worried for the safety of her own unseen benefactor. "Please, sit," Etta said softly. Marcy froze. "How do you know my name?" Etta didn't answer right away. She reached into the leather bag beside her chair and took out an object she had carried with her every single day for 15 years. She set it on the table, between the two of them. A metal name tag, warped. One corner melted and hardened, but the letters that remained were still readable under the light. T. Briggs. Marcy looked at the tag, and her whole world seemed to stop. She knew that tag. It was the tag Theo wore to work every day. The tag no one had found in the ashes. The tag she had believed burned away with him. "This," Marcy reached out a hand, then pulled it back, as if afraid touching it would make it disappear. "Where did this come from? How do you have it?" Etta sat down across from her, and for the first time in 15 years, she told the story. She told her about that night, about the smoke, about the 31 people. She told it in a voice steady and low, to the part about a collapsed door, about a man trapped on the other side, in an area where the fire had blocked every route. She said she had tried to go back. To the very last second she still could. She said that when there was no longer any way to open that door, Theo had pushed his name tag through the gap, already warped in the fire, and asked her to bring it home to Marcy. It was the only thing he still had to give. And that through the gap in the door, in those final minutes, Theo had said something to her. Marcy had begun to cry, silently, both hands over her mouth. "What did he say?" Marcy whispered. "It's been 15 years. You were the last one to hear him speak. Please." "What did he say?" Etta looked at the woman before her. One of her cheeks, where yesterday she had taken a slap in broad daylight, still ached faintly. But she wasn't thinking about that. She was only thinking about a voice hoarse behind a scorching door, 15 years ago, that had handed her something she had carried all those years. He said, Etta began, her voice trembling for the first time. "Don't let Marcy know he was afraid. Tell her he never let go. That to the very last, he was still trying to get home." Etta paused for a beat. "And he told me to look after you in his place, and to never let you know. Because if you knew it was because he had died, you would never accept it." The small office fell into a thick silence. Marcy stopped covering her mouth. She no longer tried to hide her sobs. 15 years of an unanswered question. 15 years of a nameless benefactor. 15 years of money arriving at the exact moment she needed it most, which she had always thought was a miracle, all broke open at once in a cramped office before a warped metal tag. "It was you," Marcy said, her voice shattering. "All that time. It was you. You carried him on you." She reached across the table, took hold of Etta's forearm, and she gently pushed up her sleeve. There, along the inside of her forearm, was the scar. Thin, pale, curved into the shape of a lightning bolt. Marcy looked at that scar, the scar Theo had traded for someone to carry his message home. She bent down, and she pressed a kiss to it, as if pressing a kiss to the very husband she had never been able to say goodbye to. Etta closed her eyes. For 15 years, she had hidden her tears so well she had forgotten what it felt like to let them fall. She had stood straight in a cafe while her cheek burned from a slap. She had sat through countless meetings, counted countless last dollars, without once letting anyone see her break. But in this moment, with Marcy's hand gripping her scar, with the words of a dead man finally reaching the ears of the one they had always belonged to, something in Etta, for the first time in all those years, let itself tremble, and she let herself tremble, just once, in the arms of the woman she had quietly carried for 15 years. Just once. Then she drew a deep breath, and she was able to stand, because the promise was not yet finished. The fund still had $14,200 and a long list of names. And Marcy, now, was one of the very few people on Earth who knew the truth. Meanwhile, on the other side of the city, the video had begun to spread. The customer who had raised a phone in the cafe that morning had posted it online. Within hours, it was shared, then shared again, reaching corners that had never heard the name Vance. The image of a powerful man in an expensive suit slapping a plainly dressed black woman in a crowded cafe, then laughing and brushing it off as he walked away, ignited a fury that spread very fast. Within 72 hours, the stock of Preston's corporation dropped sharply. Investors grew nervous. A few veteran journalists recognized a story too big to ignore, and within days, one of them had traced the name of the woman in the video. Loretta Bishop, and the small fund she had quietly built. Then they dug deeper, and what they found left even the most seasoned investigative reporters stunned. The woman slapped on camera was the same nameless woman whispered about in old firefighter circles, the unnamed hero of a plant fire 15 years earlier, a fire that had nearly wiped out an entire company, the company of Preston Vance's father. But Preston didn't wait for the press to force his hand. He made a decision that surprised even his closest advisors. He had someone arrange a meeting with Etta. It took considerable effort to convince her to agree. She had no interest in meeting Preston Vance, no desire to relive a story she had deliberately buried. In the end, she agreed, only because Dell, the bodyguard, had come to the fund and asked her as a personal favor, reminding her that some conversations, however unwanted, deserve to happen. They met in a quiet office, no cameras, no assistants. Etta sat down, still in the gray coat, and made it clear from the start that she expected nothing from him and wanted even less. As the conversation slowly unfolded, a picture of her life emerged that surprised Preston more than the fire itself. She lived in a small apartment on the edge of the city. She drove a car nearly 15 years old. She worked hours so long that there was almost no room left for anything resembling the comfortable life her actions had indirectly handed to others. She told him, without a trace of self-pity, about the fund she had built, about the people she had sat beside in hospital waiting rooms, the paperwork she had filled out when no one else would, the lawyers she had persuaded to work almost for free simply because she asked them personally. None of it had ever appeared in a press release. None of it had ever needed to. Preston listened in silence, growing more aware, moment by moment, of how small his own definition of success had been compared to hers. Then he began to apologize, stumbling. The words did not come naturally to him. He offered compensation, offered public recognition, offered anything he could think of to undo the slap that day. Etta let him finish. "I don't need your apology," she said, her voice even, without a trace of anger. Preston fell silent. "For 15 years, she went on, I never once needed anyone in your father's company to tell me I had done the right thing. I know what I did. I carry it right here." She touched her forearm lightly, where the scar lay beneath the fabric. "My dignity isn't something you can slap off of me, and it isn't something you can hand back to me with a check." The words fell on Preston heavier than any accusation could have, because they struck exactly at the fear he had never once dared to name in his whole life. That the worth of a person was something he could grant or take away, depending on what clothes they wore, what car they drove, what room they walked into. This woman had just shown him he was wrong down to the root. And for the first time in his life, Preston Vance did not react the way a man like him always reacts. His advisors had urged him to let the legal team quietly bury the story, the way corporations handle their ugly secrets. They warned that exposing a 15-year-old cover-up tied to his own family company could damage his image further. Preston, this time, did not care about that calculation the way he once would have. He chose to use the corporation's own resources to bring the investigation into the light. He funded an independent inquiry into exactly what had happened the night of the plant fire, and exactly who deserved credit for what had occurred. Garrett Pike, feeling the walls closing in around him, tried one last desperate move. He reached out to a few old acquaintances who had benefited indirectly from the company's gratitude after the fire, hinting that if his reputation collapsed, theirs would follow. He reminded them of old favors, old silences, agreements that had never existed on paper. But one of them, a retired safety inspector who had spent years quietly uneasy about the story everyone told, finally decided he was too tired of carrying someone else's lie. "If I go down," Pike told one old associate in a call later submitted as evidence, "a lot of people go down with me." The threat, meant to buy more silence, instead became one of the most damning pieces of evidence against him once it came to light. And while that machine began to turn, while the truth buried for 15 years began to surface, Etta still did not know that her story was about to be told before an entire nation, and that when it was told, it would no longer be a story about a slap. The public hearing took place several weeks later, in a courtroom packed beyond capacity, reporters lining the hallways, cameras positioned at every angle. Del Okafor was the first to testify. His voice was steady, though the emotion showed in every word. He described the young woman who had led him and dozens of trapped workers through a corridor that should not have existed on any rescue map. He described the wound on her forearm, the calm she held while metal collapsed around them, the way she vanished before anyone could say a word of thanks. His testimony, without exaggeration or theatrics, silenced the entire courtroom. Then, one by one, survivors of the fire took the stand. People now in their 40s and 50s, who for 15 years had believed the woman who saved them had disappeared forever without recognition. Each described the same details, independently, the same terrible wound, the same unwavering calm, the same way she never waited for thanks once the last worker was safely out. Garrett Pike's lawyers tried to challenge the consistency of memories formed during a terrifying event, but the sheer volume of matching testimony made the argument impossible to sustain. Documents from the independent inquiry Preston had funded continued to dismantle Pike's story, revealing internal correspondence from years earlier in which company leadership admitted they weren't sure who truly deserved the credit, and had chosen Pike as the public face simply because he was already on the payroll, while the real rescuer was nameless and impossible to find for comment. A lie was never a single lie. It was the slow accumulation of convenient silences, each person choosing comfort over truth, until an entire false history hardened into something everyone believed. By the final day of the hearing, the judge ordered Garrett Pike's arrest on charges of fraud and perjury connected to his old safety medal, charges that carried the real possibility of significant prison time, given the scale of the benefits he had fraudulently claimed over the years. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions as he was led away. And for the first time in 15 years, the public record finally began to reflect what had truly happened inside that burning building that night. Then the whole courtroom turned toward Preston Vance. When the judge invited any final statements relevant to the proceedings, Preston rose, walked slowly to the front, aware that every camera in the room was now aimed directly at him. he admitted, without excuse, without evasion, that he had slapped a woman in a public place out of arrogance and prejudice, judging her instantly based on nothing but her appearance and his own sense of importance. He admitted that for years, he had built his identity on the belief that his success was entirely his own creation, never once questioning the deeper history of the company he had inherited, never once wondering whose sacrifice had quietly protected the empire he so proudly claimed as his achievement. His voice, always calm and commanding in every public appearance, trembled this time. Before cameras broadcasting across the country, Preston Vance knelt down in the middle of the courtroom and offered a formal apology to Loretta Bishop, who sat in the gallery, silent. He spoke of the assistants who had watched him strike her and said nothing. The bystanders who had filmed the moment and did not intervene. The culture inside his own company that had taught everyone that challenging him was a far greater risk than staying silent. He said he understood now that the silence in that cafe had not been about Etta alone, that it reflected something rotten that had been allowed to grow for years under his leadership, and that fixing it would take more than a single gesture in a courtroom. He announced the creation of a substantial compensation fund for the workers and families affected by industrial accidents tied to his company's history, including a direct settlement, 15 years overdue, for Etta herself. He went further, announcing that he would transfer a portion of his personal shares in the company into her organization so that it would have resources far beyond anything it had ever had. The courtroom went quiet, waiting to see how Etta would respond to a moment most people assumed would bring her some measure of satisfaction. Etta stood. She smoothed the old gray coat, the coat she had worn the day it all began, and walked to the front without a moment's hesitation. She did not look at Preston with anger, nor did she rush to embrace the apology being offered to her before the whole nation. She turned toward the crowd, toward the reporters, the survivors, the cameras, and she began to speak in the same calm, unshaken voice she had used in the cafe a week earlier. She said she accepted the apology, not because Preston's words erased what had happened, but because holding on to anger had never been the kind of person she wanted to be. She thanked the survivors who had come forward with the truth. She thanked Dell, who had carried the memory of that night for 15 years without ever forgetting the debt he believed he owed. Then she turned toward the people listening, and her voice grew firmer, carrying the weight of everything she had endured in silence all those years. She said never to judge a person by the color of their skin, never to assume the worst about someone because of the clothes they wear, the car they drive, or the neighborhood they come from. She said the people who change the world rarely look like the people history chooses to honor, that quiet sacrifice is almost always overlooked, while loud and convenient stories are rewarded. She said a scar on someone's arm might mean nothing, or it might mean everything, and the only way to know the difference is to stop judging and start listening. When she finished, the whole courtroom rose to its feet, applauding longer than anyone expected, even the reporters. Many of them visibly moved by words that carried none of the bitterness they had braced themselves to hear. Etta left the courthouse that day without waiting for more applause or attention, slipping out a side entrance to avoid the crowd of reporters at the main doors. Months later, everything settled into a new shape, not perfect, but enough. Corridor Fund did not close. It expanded, opening offices in other regions, where workers injured in industrial accidents had once had nowhere to turn. Donations kept coming long after the media frenzy cooled, sustained by a steady stream of people who had read her story and wanted to be part of something larger than a viral moment. Dell left the work of guarding powerful men entirely. He chose to work alongside Etta full-time, finally given the chance to repay the debt he had quietly carried for 15 years. He spent his days running between hospitals and work sites instead of boardrooms and private elevators, and more than one old acquaintance noted that, for the first time in years, he looked truly at peace. Marcy Briggs was there too, at the fund's new office. Her son, now grown, sometimes stopped by after class. One afternoon, as sunlight slanted through the office window, Etta called Marcy over. She didn't say much. She simply took the woman's hand, opened it, and placed a small object in her palm. A metal name tag, warped. One corner melted and hardened. The letters that remained still readable under the light. T. Briggs. "I've held on to it long enough," Etta said softly. "It's time it went home." As she reached out, the gray sleeve slid down slightly, revealing, in the afternoon light, the thin scar curved like a lightning bolt along the inside of her forearm. The same scar that had once caused her pain enough to nearly cost her an arm. The same scar that had forced an entire city, and then an entire nation, to remember a truth too easily forgotten. A person isn't measured by how they look when the whole world is watching. A person is measured by what they do when no one is looking at all. Marcy closed her hand tightly around the tag and looked at her. And Etta had already turned toward the door, where a young woman had just walked in, holding a folder, a new name on the long list of people still waiting. That night, 31 people walked out of the fire. But how many other names, in other buildings, on other nights, are still standing behind a closed door, waiting for someone brave enough to turn back inside for them? Thank you for staying with this story all the way to the very last moment. If Etta reminded you of someone who quietly did something kind for you when no one was watching, or someone you never got the chance to thank, leave us a few words in the comments. Tell us your story, or simply what you felt after listening this far. The lines you write might be exactly what a stranger needs to read today. And if this story touched you, don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel so you never miss the stories to come. We'll see you in the next story. Stay kind, even when no one is watching.